every first Sunday of September. For 19 years, the parish book of St. Thomas Church records the same entry. The infant's name, James Elroy. The mother's name, Anne Elroy. Date of birth, August 31st. Date of baptism, September 3rd. The priest's signature, different every year. The child, always the same. In the photographs, he never ages. His eyes always stare directly into the lens. But no one in the parish knows the Elroy family. No one remembers the mother. And the boy, they say, never leaves the church. If he was born in 1902, and who was baptized in 1921, and why is he still there? The Church of St. Thomas Saturday sunken in the landscape, as if the bogs had been trying to swallow it for decades, and had simply given up out of exhaustion. The graveyard that circled it was broken-backed and uneven, its stones leaning like weary teeth, moss-drowned names, and iron fences rusted into crumbling filigree. The bell rang every Sunday at the same hour. Though no one ever admitted to pulling the rope, the sound was thin, reluctant, like an apology. By the turn of the century, few truly attended the church. The same faces, the same families, those too proud to leave or too fearful to try. A widower with a shaking hand, a mother with 3 mute children, a milkman who Saturday in the back and never closed his eyes to pray. They came not from faith, but inertia. St. Thomas was something you tolerated, like fog or time. When Miss Eleanor Walcott arrived from the diocesan office in York, no one paid much attention. She was young, bookish, and quietly efficient. She didn't ask questions, which they liked. She worked late, which they ignored. She moved into a spare room, just behind the sacristy, and spent her evenings at the heavy wooden table with stacks of brittle registers, a small lamp, and her typewriter clicking softly into the night. The church had kept its books with obsessive precision since 1784. Baptisms, marriages, burials all carefully handwritten by trembling clerical hands. Eleanor's task was simple: digitize the archive, record any historical anomalies, and return the physical volumes to diocesan storage. She'd done it before, thousands of times, but not like this. She was halfway through the 1913 register when she noticed it. James Elroy. Mother, Anne Elroy. Date of birth, the 31st of August 1913. Date of baptism, the 3rd of September 1913. The entry itself was unremarkable save perhaps for the clumsiness of the ink, as if written in haste, but when she flipped to the next year, just to confirm a death or continuation, the name caught her again. Page 53, 1914. James Elroy. Mother, Anne Elroy. Date of birth, the 31st of August 1914. Date of baptism, the 3rd of September 1914. Same names, same dates, same godparents, same comment in the margin: the child rests in the Lord's care. But the handwriting was different. The pen used a different ink, deeper, sharper. She frowned. Perhaps it was a clerical copy, a common mistake. She checked the next year. Page 67, 1915. James Elroy. Anne Elroy, 31 August, 3 September. Again? Her breath slowed. She rifled forward. Page 80, 1916. The entry repeated, unchanged. The handwriting changed again, this time more elegant, with looping LS and a careful flourish beneath the names. The pattern persisted, year after year, always the same child, always the same mother, always the same dates. She checked the burial records. Nothing, no death, no infant coffin, not a single mention of James Elroy beyond the yearly baptisms. At first, she assumed it must be an error, a lazy priest copying over a previous record to save time. But the changes in handwriting told another story. The church saw 6 different vicars between 1913 and 1921, and every year, one of them had written a new entry. No gaps, no skips, no explanation. She copied the entries, one by one, onto tracing paper. She noted the differences in penmanship, ink quality, parchment color, but the content never changed, and that was what began to scratch at her. The sameness was too perfect. Even the word choices, the tiny phrase in Latin at the bottom, cur in manus domini, was there every time, never varied. She showed the ledger to the current vicar, Father Morley. He studied the pages in silence, his jaw tight, his fingertips blanching white where they gripped the register. When he finally looked at her, his face was pale and drawn. He told her, carefully, to replace the books in the archive and not mention the anomaly again. He said the diocesan office had already reviewed those years and found nothing of concern. Eleanor knew that wasn't true. The next morning, the archive door had been sealed. A wax sigil had been pressed into the lock. She had no key. That evening, the church, Keishers, Morleys, even the Sparrows vanished from the office drawer. No one admitted to touching them. When she returned to her room behind the sacristy, she found her notes gone. The tracing paper was missing. Her typewriter ribbon had been unspooled and crumpled into a tangled black knot on her pillow. But worst of all was the new page left in her folder, handwritten in ink she had used. It bore only one line: James Elroy, baptized 3 September, witnessed. And beneath it, the ink was still wet. They began to notice the light first, just a faint glow behind the stained glass windows. Long after evening prayers had ended and the nave was supposed to be locked, it came in pulse flickers of yellow gold like candlelight, but far too steady, too cold. More than once, someone passing the church late at night swore they saw movement inside. Not the jerky, shadowy flit of mice or birds, but something slower, rhythmic, like the careful steps of someone pacing in a circle. The first to speak of it openly was old Mr. Daltrey, the gravid digger. He said he saw a shape small, pale walking counterclockwise around the font. He didn't stay to look longer. The next day, his dog refused to cross the gravel path that led to the church gate. It barked and whined, clawing at its leash until he let it go. It ran straight home. It wouldn't go near the church again. Then came the boy from the Cromley farm. He'd been dared by his older cousins to peek through a crack in the boarded vestry window. He was pale when he returned, shaking too hard to hold the cup of milk they gave him. His words came slowly, haltingly. There was a boy in white standing by the basin. His hair was wet. He was smiling. His mother forbade him from walking that path again. A week later, the font was found full, brimming with water, though no one in the parish admitted to filling it. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the stained glass above like a mirror, but the stone around it was damp as though something had been splashing there. The lilies on the altar, replaced every Saturday by the women's circle, had withered to black stems overnight. The new priest, Father Hargrove, arrived after Father Morley's disappearance. He was younger, skeptical, a man of protocol. He made no mention of the rumors and ignored the parishioners' sidelong glances whenever the font was discussed, until the morning he found the note. It was just a fragment torn from a newspaper so old the ink had gone soft and purple. It lay on the pillow in the guest room. His pillow, damp to the touch, curled at the edges. In the center, the faint imprint of a child's palm, and a single date stamped in the corner, September 3rd. That evening, Hargrove walked the church grounds himself. He found nothing. He returned the next morning with nails and a hammer and boarded the vestry door shut. He stayed in the rectory a few more nights, then he left. No letter, no forwarding address. Autumn passed, then winter. The pews Saturday cold and mostly empty. Only a few elderly parishioners remained regular in their attendance, though even they seemed reluctant to stay after dusk. The font stayed covered. The doors remained locked each night, but when the new curate arrived reluctantly, at the bishop's insistence, brought the parish book from the diocesan archives with him, and on page 237, beneath the same looping header as the previous years, was another entry: James Elroy, son of an Elroy, born August 31st, baptized September 3rd. The ink was fresh, slightly smeared. No one would admit to writing it. No one had even opened the book that week. But there it was. Again. It began with a shoebox. Miss Walcott, still living in the small stone room behind the sacristy, had been organizing the attic above the rectory. The diocese had requested scans of old photographs for their online archive, and the job had fallen to her. She sorted through piles of stiff sepia portraits, confirmation days, group shots of past rectors, stained groupings of school children, all gathered with solemn faces in front of the church's iron gate. Most were unremarkable. Most smelled of mildew and long-forgotten mothballs, until she opened the box labeled simply James. Inside were 12 photographs, all identical at first glance. Each showed the interior of St. Thomas, taken from the same angle: the central aisle, the font in the foreground, the altar in the back. A single child stood before the font, a boy in white, his hands folded, feet bare. wet hair combed flat to his forehead. A faint reflection in the font's water mirrored his outline, but not his face. Each photo had a year scribbled on the back, in different hands: 1903, 1904, 1905, and on through 1921. The boy never changed. His expression was neutral. His eyes stared directly at the camera, unblinking, unsmiling. The lighting varied slightly between shots, and in a few, the candles on the altar were lit. But the child, he remained exactly the same. Height, posture, clothing, every time. The grain and chemical composition of the photos varied, as did the exposure styles, consistent with different cameras and decades. Yet the child was unchanged. At first, Miss Walcott believed it was a studio trick, a copy pasted year after year, some kind of morbid prank played by previous clerics. But when she enlarged the images on her scanner, she noticed something she hadn't expected. In every image, the boy's shadow was cast in a different direction. It matched the sun on the day the photo was taken, and his eyes, they reflected light inconsistently, even catching glimmers from candelabras only pressed in later years. This wasn't the same image duplicated. The boy had been there every year. He had stood in the same spot for nearly 2 decades, unaged, unmoved, alive. Miss Walcott brought the photos to the village historian, Mr. Leeming, a retired archivist himself. He was known for being skeptical of church legends, having spent his life disproving village myths. But when he saw the box, he grew pale. He asked to keep them overnight. The next morning, he didn't answer his door. When they broke it down, they found the kettle still warm and the lights on. His study was in perfect order, except for one thing. The box of photos was gone, and in its place on the desk was a single Polaroid, a new one, color, undated. It showed the boy again, the font, the altar, only now the windows behind him were stained with modern repair glass, the blue panes installed just 2 years ago. The candles on the altar were the new electric ones, donated after the fire in the vestry, and in the corner of the image, reflected faintly in the polished brass of the processional cross, was the outline of Mr. Leeming himself taking the photograph. The coroner ruled it a disappearance. Miss Walcott didn't sleep for days after. She boarded her windows and refused visitors. She kept her scanner unplugged and covered every mirror in her quarters. But still, she could hear it, the click of a shutter, faint, always just outside her door. And when she opened her drawer one evening to retrieve a fresh ribbon for her typewriter, she found another photo waiting beneath the paper. This one she hadn't seen before. The boy stood at the font, as always, but now, his face was slightly turned, not toward the camera, toward her. His expression was not blank anymore. His mouth was open just enough to show teeth. His eyes held a glint not of mischief, but of knowing. She destroyed the photo, burned it in the basin behind the rectory, but it came back, tucked in the hymnal on the pulpit the next morning, waiting, unchanged. Soon after, other copies began to appear. One slipped through the post slot in the town library. Another was found folded into the offering envelope of an empty pew. Each one showed the boy a little closer to the lens than before. By the 4th week, it was no longer centered in the shot. He was off to the side, as if moving, coming forward, toward the camera, toward whoever held it. On the last Sunday of the month, the parish clerk opened the record book to prepare for Mass. On the inside cover, written in a small, soaked hand, was a list of dates, all previous years of baptism. At the bottom, a new entry had been added, 2025 witnessed. No signature, just a smear of ink, like a fingertip dragged across the page. That night, the lights came on in the church again. No one entered, no one dared, but when the village constable passed by during his final patrol, he paused just long enough to see it, a small figure, dressed in white, walking up the aisle, slowly, not toward the altar, toward the door. Miss Walcott had not intended to return to the archives after what had happened with the photographs. She had sworn it off entirely, locked the doors, packed the records, left a note for the diocese, recommend discontinuation of physical handling. But in the weeks following the final Polaroid's appearance, the one that showed the boy stepping forward from the font, something shifted in her. Not a desire for truth, but something closer to compulsion. An ache in the base of her skull, a steady tapping just behind her eyes. She began to dream of the parish book, heavy and unlatched, its spine creaking open without her touch. By mid-October, she found herself seated at the old wooden desk again. Candles lit, tea untouched, she brought the book into the light. Her hands shook as she turned the pages. She didn't know what she was searching for exactly, but instinct told her to look not at the entries themselves, but at the hands that wrote them, the signatures, the dates, the names of the priests who had recorded each instance of James Elroy's baptism. It had been easy, all these years, to attribute it to error, a copyist's mistake, an accidental duplication, but when she examined the sequence closely, a darker pattern emerged. 17 names, 17 priests, each a different man. They, she discovered with mounting dread, had died within a year of recording the baptism. Some of the deaths were mundane, but many were strange. Father Penwell, 1907, found drowned in the church well, though he'd had no reason to descend into it. Father Redmere, 1913, struck by lightning during an unseasonal storm, while walking alone across an empty field. Father Matheson, 1919, heart failure at 33, following weeks of vivid hallucinations described in his diary as the boy behind the water. Every year, a new name, a new signature, a new death, except one. Father Randall, the only surviving priest to have recorded the Elroy entry, and lived beyond the following year. Ms. Walcott tracked him to a long-term care facility outside Durham, a crumbling Victorian asylum now called St. Luke's Rest. They let her in with minimal fuss. Father Randall was 98 and no longer considered dangerous. She was warned that he rarely spoke, that he had lived in a state of near catatonia for decades. But when she entered his room, the air changed. The old man sat in a wheelchair, facing the far wall. His mouth was slack, but his eyes were open, alert. She greeted him softly, unsure what she expected. He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't look at her, but his gaze never wavered from the far right corner of the room. There, on the floor beside the radiator, sat a porcelain bowl. It was filled to the brim with water. Miss Walcott stepped closer. The bowl had no purpose, no inscription, not even a towel beside it, but the surface of the water was perfectly still, reflecting the dim light like a pane of glass. As she watched, Father Randall raised one trembling hand and pointed. Then, in a voice dry as dust, he whispered, "He is not a child, he is water, he is the right, he is the promise." He said nothing else. She left within the hour, shaken. The words followed her back to West Elms, circling her mind like wasps. That night, she returned to the parish archive. As she opened the ledger to re-examine the oldest entries, a damp scent rose from the pages, not the usual musty age of paper, but the sharp, organic tang of stagnant water. She looked down. The corners of the parchment were wet, not stained, while drops clung to the edges. She reached to lift one page and found her fingertips smeared with ink, the words blurring, bleeding, dissolving beneath her touch. Whole years were now unreadable. But James's name remained. Always legible, always dry. In a panic, she turned to the baptismal register. The pages there, too, had begun to warp. Some had buckled into soft waves, like parchment soaked and dried again. On one leaf, faint scratches had emerged beneath the ink, shallow gouges that had not been there before. She held the page closer to the light. Etched deep into the paper, in uneven, jagged lines, were letters. Elroy, James. As if clawed from underneath. She pulled back from the book. Something was wrong with the room. The air had grown humid, stifling, as though she stood inside a bathhouse. Her sleeves clung to her arms. The candle nearest the font flickered not with draught, but with pressure, the kind of shiver caused by something large, unseen, shifting in the space beside her. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she filed a request with the local records office in Barnington County. She asked for all birth certificates issued between 1900 and 1910 bearing the surname Elroy, specifically any records for Anne or James. 3 days later, she received a thin envelope with the county seal. No such names existed. No birth certificate for Anne Elroy. No record of a James Elroy, born on August 31st, 1902. No trace in the census. No family burial plots. No tax documents. Nothing. It was impossible. A child without birth, a mother without past, and yet, every year, Without fail, their names returned to the register on September 3rd, not duplicated, not photocopied, not rewritten by hand from a template, but entered, in fresh ink, with a new hand, by someone who had access to the book, or something. The church had been locked on that day since the early 2000s, and yet the entry still appeared. She checked the guest logs, court v files, even dust patterns on the altar floor. There was never a footprint, never a disturbance. The font was sealed each year before the date, yet each year afterward, the book told the same story. James Elroy, son of Anne, baptized September 3rd, font sanctified, witness pressed. She highlighted the last word. Witness. There was always a witness, but never a name. Miss Walcott began to wonder, was she next? Was she being groomed, watched, chosen? The old pattern had been broken once before, with Randall. Perhaps it needed to begin again. She checked the margin of this year's book. At first, it was blank. Then, under the ultraviolet lamp she used for faded ink, she saw it. Just 3 words. Witness, in progress. The church had never felt so quiet. Not empty. Miss Walcott had learned the difference, but quiet in the way of something listening, something patient. The silence was taut, suspended in the red shadows of the rafters, in the smooth marble lip of the font, in the deep throat of the apse. She had locked every door. She had extinguished every light but one. Hidden in the sacristy, behind stacks of old cassocks and a cracked confessional screen, she waited with a camera pressed to her chest and a leather-bound notebook gripped in white fingers. It was the eve of the 20th baptism. She had not told anyone, not the diocese, not the historical society, not even Father Emmett, who had offered to bless the church at sundown, and whom she turned away with a forced smile and a lie about renovations. No, if it was going to happen again, it had to be seen, witnessed. She told herself that would no longer frighten her, even as she underlined it 3 times in her notes. At precisely 2:47 a.m., she heard the first step. It was soft, there, a single shift of weight on the stone floor that came from nowhere and echoed as if from inside the walls. She frowned. Breath caught. Another footfall followed, then another. But when she peered through the slatted screen into the nave, it was empty. The altar stood in stillness. The pews were undisturbed. The font-tree, white, untouched, glimmered faintly in the candlelight. Then everything went silent again. She dared not move. 14 minutes passed. At 3:01 a.m., the sound came again, but it wasn't footsteps. It was a splash. Soft, controlled, as though something had broken the water not from above, but from within. Miss Walcott inched forward. The camera trembled in her hand as she peered out. The font was no longer dry. It brimmed with water, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting all along, and in its center stood a boy. Small, pale, silent. His white shift clung to his skin, with hair matted across his forehead. His hands hung at his sides, his eyes, dark and bottomless, locked onto hers the moment she stepped out. No fear, no curiosity, only recognition. His lips moved. No sound emerged. The gesture repeated, slower this time, more deliberate, 3 words, again and again. She strained to read them, to lip-read the shape. The 3rd word might have been remain, or remained, but the first. The boy lifted his right hand and pointed. Not at her. At the altar? More specifically at the leather-bound baptismal register resting on its velvet cushion. She stepped toward it, slowly. Each step echoed in her ears like a heartbeat. The boy did not move. The surface of the water did not ripple. She reached the book, its cover as dry and pristine as if it had never been opened. Then she looked up. The font was empty. The boy was gone. She staggered back, nearly dropping the camera. No wet footprints, no sound. Only the book, its leather darker than before, the grain tight like scarred skin. Across the front, in curling letters that had not been there minutes before, appeared a message burned into the cover not by pen, but by some ancient pressure, as if heat and intention alone had etched it. Verba data pactum mane. The word is given, the covenant remains. Her throat tightened, her knees buckled. She sank onto the step beneath the altar and stared at the phrase. The words felt older than the church itself. She didn't need a full translation. She had studied Latin long enough to understand the shape of a vowel, something spoken into water, something that outlives its speaker. When dawn broke, she didn't wait. She carried every book from the archive: baptismal, marriage, death, attendance, donation, and piled them in the gravel courtyard behind the sacristy. She poured kerosene over the stack. Her hands didn't hesitate when she struck the match. It felt like confession, like punishment. The fire took quickly. Pages curled into fists, ink blackened, then disappeared. She stayed until only ash remained. She returned to the church that afternoon, soot-streaked and trembling. For the first time in weeks, the building felt light again, normal, hollow. The air was dry. The font was empty. She allowed herself, cautiously, to hope. That evening, the sexton called her. He had gone to the sacristy to retrieve vestments for Sunday. The books were there. All of them? Lined neatly on the shelf in alphabetical order, clean, crisp, untouched. The pages bore no scorch marks, no scent of ash. Only 19 entries, each for James Elroy, each with a different priest's name. She drove to the church at once. She opened the baptismal book first. The page for 1920 for the coming year was blank. No writing, no signature. Not yet. But as she turned to close it, something caught her eye. At the very bottom, pressed faintly into the final line, was an impression. Not ink, not pencil. Pressure. As if something had pressed its finger small, wet, persistent into the paper and begun to trace a shape. A letter, then another, beginning a name, letter by letter, and beneath it, an even fainter script, at decimum et vicimum, to the 20th. It was still coming, and someone or something had to write it. They shuttered the church under a name no one believed, a formality, structural concerns, lack of active congregation, loss of diocesan funding, phrases pressed into paper by men in distant cities, who had never seen the condensation bead on the altar rail in the middle of a drought, who had never heard the sound of water in a sealed room, who had never opened the baptismal register, and found their own name etched faintly beneath the boy's. The truth was known in whispers, in closed shutters and crosses drawn on doorframes. The villagers understood. They had seen the boy behind the stained glass. They had walked their dogs across the lane and watched as the animals stopped short, ears pinned, rolling low at the stone steps. They had seen the lights flicker on at night when no one held the keys. The closure began with final rites no one attended. A quiet afternoon, a brief letter from the bishop, then came the work crews. The font was filled with cement, thick, gray, permanent. They poured it in one unbroken motion, sealing the basin beneath 600 pounds of industrial mix. The altar was dismantled, carried out in pieces under plastic tarp, and sent to storage. The candles were extinguished for the last time, the windows boarded, the bells removed. No one stayed to see the last lock turn. No one lingered in the yard. The graveyard behind the church became overgrown within a year. Miss Walcott disappeared shortly after. Some believed she'd gone abroad. Others said the diocese had sent her away, quietly, perhaps even to the same asylum where Father Randall had spent his final years. A few believed she was dead, but there was no funeral, no obituary, only an empty house, her mailbox stuffed with damp, unopened letters from academic journals, and a single photograph left behind on the dining table, blurry, dark, and water-damaged. It showed the church interior at night. A faint shape stood behind the font. A child, or something shaped like one? 10 years passed. The town moved on, at least on the surface. The church remained locked. The diocese erected a wire fence and a condemned sign. Nature cracked in. Ivy overtook the facade. Birds nested in the broken bell tower. The only humans who approached were the curious, the reckless, and the strangers who came asking about old baptisms. But every year, on the 3rd of September, the same thing happened. No matter the weather, rain, heat, frost, there was always a wet handprint on the front door. It was never smeared, never blurred, a perfect impression. 5 small fingers, a palm pressed firmly into the rotting wood, as if left in farewell or warning. That same day, without fail, a white envelope would appear in the rector's mailbox, always unmarked, no stamp, no return address. Inside, a single page, thick paper, handwritten. The same words each year. Name of child, James Elroy. Mother's name, Anne Elroy. Date of birth, August 31st. Date of baptism, September 3rd. The handwriting never changed. Slanted, precise, with a faint ink smudge near the signature line, A small water stain would bloom in the corner of the page, as if the envelope had been dipped in holy water moments before being sealed. No one ever saw who delivered them. The local priest, a man from Leeds who had taken over the broader parish and avoided the old church altogether, tried burning the pages. The next year, there were 2 copies, one in his box, one tucked into the latch of the condemned church door. Eventually, he stopped trying. Some parishioners said the boy had never existed, that it was a shared delusion, a regional haunting, a tale that grew in the telling, but others older residents who remembered Father Morley, or the brief, trembling homilies of Father Emmett spoke less. They watched the mail, they walked their dogs on different streets, they drew their curtains tighter on the 2nd of September. The legend said he had been born in 1902. If he had grown, he would have been over 100 now, but he never did. In every photograph, every description, he remained the same. Dark hair, wet skin, why, unblinking eyes, a child, always, never aging. Because something had stopped him, not death, not disease, but something deeper, a loop written in water, a sacrament made flesh, a promise spoken too clearly, too often, in a place where the veil was thin and faith had teeth. They had sealed the font, but no one ever touched the pipes below. No one dared examine the drainage, or trace the line that led into the earth, into the deeper aquifer beneath the hillside, because water remembers, because the body had touched it, because the words had been spoken above it 19 times. And once a vow is made in consecrate water, it does not die. It waits. Every year, on the same date, same name, same child. He would not grow. He would not rot. He would not fade. Because what had been summoned was not a boy. It was a reflection of belief, of ritual, of repetition. It was the word made wet, the sacrament given shape. And if you buried the water, if you sealed the font, if you burned the books, you had only delayed him. Because when the covenant was spoken aloud, and written down, and sealed by touch, it became part of the place. And he will remain a child forever.